The Vampire Prince's Toxic Consort, BL. Chapter 1 The Marriage. Lucius was dreaming of a handsome, dark, devilish god with 8 packs and black eyes feeding him the most exquisite wine he had ever tasted with those luscious lips when the butler, Mr. Carter's stern voice dragged him out of paradise. Master Lucius, wake up. No matter how grown up Lucius was, Mr. Carter's voice could always sober him up instantly. He propped his eyelids open, rubbed his face, and groaned from the onslaught of a hangover headache. Huh? What? His lordship wants to see you. Mr. Carter stood straight and tall next to his disheveled bed, unfazed by the chaotic image of several of his half-naked, passed-out frat friends and escorts scattering on the lounge bed, couch, and floor. Lucius sat up groggily, blonde locks all tangled and messy. What time is it? It's 10 in the morning. Geez, Carter, so early. They are waiting for you. Carter waved his hand, and a maid quickly entered with newly washed clothes in her arm. Lucius dragged his heavy body out of the warmth of the comforter, managed to finish brushing his teeth, washed his face and brushed his shoulder-length hair into a presentable state in 10 minutes, and put on the attire Carter had chosen for him. He looked much more like a demure college boy in the white shirt and muted green sweater, a look that his parents preferred. Lucius looked into the mirror and rolled his eyes. Why do you dress me to look like my brother? Carter replied calmly, your brother no longer wears secular clothing, Master Lucius. I meant like my brother before he became the high priest. Lucius sighed. What's going on? Why do you want me to please my parents? What did I do this time? I'm afraid I'm not in the position to disclose. Fine, I will find out soon anyway, Lucius grunted as he left the room. Lord Rosenfield was standing next to the window, a cigarette between his fingers, while Lady Rosenfield was sitting on the couch, looking tense. Lucius spotted some small cakes, cookies and tea on the table, fetched one scone with jam, took a generous bite to appease his empty stomach, and slumped into the nearest armchair. You want to see me? Lucius asked with a mouthful of scone. You are getting married, said Lord Rosenfield curtly. Lucius blinked. What? You are of age, and it is an honorable arrangement, said Lady Rosenfield softly. It's your chance to serve your king, your country, your people, and defend our belief. Lucius's chewing paused in alarm. What does my marriage have to do with serving the country? Lord Rosenfield turned around and strolled closer to his wife but kept his eyes locked on his son. You are betrothed to Prince Dorian Ashdown of Eternia. Lucius choked on his scone and coughed for a few moments before blurting out, are you fucking kidding me? I don't care how you speak with your friends, but this is not how we talk in this house. Lord Rosenfield berated. Lucius couldn't stay calm. He stood up abruptly and almost knocked over the teacup. I can't swear, and yet you can sell me to some abusive bloodthirst devil psychopath. What kind of father are you? Do you really hate me this much? It's in their premises of the peace treaty. Dorian Ashdown specifically said your name, and if I don't agree to it, the war will never end. Do you want your people to suffer for another decade, or even worse, be enslaved by the vampires in 5 years? Why in 7 heavens would that prince want me as his consort? I know vampires don't give a shit about sexual orientation like our people unfortunately do, but still, why me? I haven't even met him. Both of his parents fell into an eerily protracting silence. Lucius immediately sensed something was fishy. What's going on? Ere long, Lady Rosenfield finally answered, in fact, they want Julian. Margaret, he will know sooner or later, retorted the lady, we have to tell him the truth. There is no other way. Lucius gaped at his parents. Their words reverberated in his head and whelmed all his organs in icy water. It all made sense now. Julian, his perfect twin brother. They had exactly the same look. Strawberry blonde wavy hair, alabaster skin, almond-shaped hazel eyes, and lean frames. The only difference was that Lucius was slightly taller. However, somehow, their personality diverged drastically during the process of growing up. Julian was exceptional in every aspect. Intelligent, responsible and had a kind heart of an angel. The dream son that even the king would hope to have. Meanwhile, Lucius grew to be a regular flippant and lazy posh scion, drinking and foodled about with his friends and barely keeping out of the prying eyes of the reporters. Lord Rosenfield would thank God every day as long as Lucius didn't become a scandal. The difference became more prominent and substantial when Julian received the calling and decided to become a priest when he was 15. And soon, he was known for having a divine gift of hearing God's voice and performing miracles and was promoted to high priest when he was only 23 years old, the youngest high priest in history. Many people even believed that he was the messenger of God, a true angel incarnated. In a country where 80% of people were believers, such a well-loved person would be seen as the hope against the looming darkness. A sign that God was standing with them against the devil's advocates, vampires. In a sense, Julian was more important than the king. Maybe that was why Dorian Ashdown made such an infuriating request. It's a sacrilege and humiliation of their belief. If they choose not to accept, Eternia would have a perfect excuse to continue the war. But accepting it would mean that their symbols of purity and hope fell into the inferno of obscenity and depravity, and it would surely damage people's trust in their king and the government. Riot might ensue, and the war-decimated kingdom could not bear more turmoil. But he asked for Julian, Lucius said in a hollowed voice. If he finds out that I'm not, surely it would make him more furious. Lord Rosenfield pressed out the cigarette in the ashtray and said, no. He will not. Because you are Julian. I'm Lucius. Are you mad? Not anymore. Lord Rosenfield raised his eyes and regarded his son intensely. Not since yesterday. We have changed your name to Julian on all legal documents and your brother's to Lucius. And today, our acceptance of the clauses has been sent to Eternia. We won't break any clause by sending you. A loud humming filled Lucius's head, and a terrible giddiness rushed toward him like a wild horse, knocking him to the seat. He couldn't breathe. Dorian Ashdown will kill me. No, he will not. Even vampires have laws, and murdering their consort will be punished severely. And he also promised not to force you to turn into one of them. Is that supposed to make me feel better? Lucius laughed anguishedly while trying his best to contain the excruciating hurt welling up in his eyes. Julian agreed to this. He did. So it's all settled. You finally find a chance to get rid of me and only keep the son you want. Lucius sneered coldly, eyes red. You don't care what they would do to me. Lucius. His mother tried to say something, but he no longer wanted to hear another word. He stood up abruptly and stormed out of the room, knowing his fate was already settled. He shouldn't be surprised. Of course they would choose the better son over the insignificant one. But it still hurt like hell. And worst of all, his father didn't even say, sorry, as he pushed his own flesh and blood toward the depth of the abyss. Chapter 2 Choice. Lucius woke up to a knocking sound on the door. He rubbed his eyes, feeling disoriented and nauseating from all the wine he had consumed the night before. Lou, open the door, came a contralto female voice. Lucius knew the voice. It was his big sister, Imelda. She moved out of the manor after married Marquis Sheridan, and Lucius hadn't seen her for almost a year. Imelda was 10 years older than him and Julian, and sometimes she was like a mother more than a sister to the twins. Growing up, she was the only one in the household that Lucius was willing to confide in because she cared about him. His parents probably called her here to talk some sense into him since the day for him to depart was getting closer, and they couldn't risk Lucius blowing their truce with Eternia. Lucius didn't answer. Did she come to persuade him into performing his duty and sacrifice for the country, as well? The thought gave him a bitter taste of betrayal in his mouth. Lou, I swear if you don't open the door I will kick it down. Lucius groaned in annoyance and dragged himself out of bed and opened the door. Imelda was 2 steps away from the door about to give a roundhouse kick, and she gasped as she saw the state Lucius was in. My goodness, you look like shit. Lucius rolled his eyes. Good, then Ashdown can just dissolute the engagement and send me back. Imelda's expression softened, and Lucius saw pity in her eyes. She passed him and entered the room. Lucius glanced venomously at the 2 guards standing outside, sent here to prevent him from escaping, and shut the door forcefully. Imelda was in her mid-30s and yet still looking in her early 20s. She had the same strawberry blonde hair color as their mother, porcelain skin and blue eyes, and a covetous body accentuated with a tight red blouse and black leather pants. She settled on the couch, lighted her cigarette, and drew deeply, exhaling a long white mist. I didn't know about this until last week. So, don't act as if you were going to be against it. It's too good a deal. Lucius poured himself a cup of water and gulped it down, feeling slightly less miserable. Imelda gaped at him. It pains me that you think I would choose to sacrifice you over the so-called peace. This is not peace. This is surrender. And now we will have to pay tribute to those sadistic monsters, sending defenseless people to them as pets or blood bags and watching them enslave humanity. Lucius scoffed bitterly. It's all settled. Did you know our mother came to see me the other day, begging me to do my part, perform my aristocratic duty and pretend to be Julian and be a pliant sweetheart so Ashdown would be pleased. She said it in a very compassionate way, as if she felt sorry for me, but still, she chose to send me so her precious Julian won't be defiled. And father, he got angrier as time passed, and one day he just yelled at me that I should be happy about the arrangement since I like cocks more than vaginas anyway, that I can finally go somewhere I belong to. Imelda was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "It's not your fault, Lucius." And that broke the young man's barely keeping veneer. Lucius buried his face into his hands. I kept wondering if I'm more like my brother, would they still agree to this? But you are not, and you shouldn't be. Quote, but you still agreed to come and talk me into it. No, I agreed to come because I want to ensure you are not doing stupid stuff, like shutting yourself in and not eating, which is exactly what is happening. I didn't lock myself in. They locked me in so I can't escape. Lucius spat. Didn't you see all those guards at the door and around my windows? They are sent by the crown to protect me. They even took my phone, laptop, and tablet, so I can't contact someone for help. Imelda pressed the cigarette into the ashtray, sat next to Lucius, and wrapped her arm around her little brother. Lucius laid his head on her shoulder, taking a deep breath to take in the scent of her perfume to quell his nerve. You can run, Imelda said quietly, and I will help you. Lucius paused and sat straight, peering into her eyes to see if she was serious. Imelda's gaze was steady and calm. I'm serious. I know some people. They can get you a new name, identity, and documents and get you out of Anther. You won't be able to come back after this, but you will be safe as long as you keep your heads low for a while, at least until everything is settled. I've already made some inquiries on your behalf before I come. You just need to tell me if you want to go. Lucius blinked. For real? Imelda nodded. If I make a phone call now, at 3:45 a.m., all the electricity of the manor will be cut off, and all alarms will be disabled, all locks open. Someone will create a distraction to make it looks like theft, and you just open the window, and someone will come to pick you up. By tomorrow 8 a.m., you will be on a plane to Estos. Lucius gaped at her incredulously. Just what kind of people have you been mixing with? Let's just say Mom and Dad will have a heart attack if they know. Imelda grinned. Lucius felt like he didn't know his big sister at all. He had so many questions, but now was not the time to ask. He had a huge decision to make, and he didn't have enough time to contemplate. What will happen after I leave? Asked Lucius. Imelda shook her head. You don't need to worry about it. This is your life, but I have to. Lucius stood up and paced around the room, all kinds of thoughts swirling in his tempestuous head. He didn't think he'd had choices, but now that he did, it all became even more complicated. This is something all parties agreed to. It's an order from the crown and the churches. What will happen to Mom and Dad? Hell, what will happen to Julian? You are only torturing yourself to think about these. They are beyond your control. Imelda said morosely, if you want to avoid that fate they arranged for you, this is your only out. And you shouldn't look back. It may sound cruel, but in this crazy world, what is not? Lucius was not a saint like Julian. He never wept for homeless people, never pitied those who suffered in famine on some distant lands, and never worried about the world's future. In his view, those were not his problems to solve, so why bothered? But his was different. This was about his family's and many people's lives. If he was gone, then they couldn't fulfill the compact with Eternia unless they sent the real Julian. His father and mother would be severely punished, and Julian would probably have to go to Eternia as the price of continuing the war would be too big. But could Julian survive it? The vampires were the predators. They used to hide in the darkness of the night, but since their number rapidly grew and the first vampire king Edward Ashdown sat on the throne of Eternia and claimed that it would be a vampire nation, they no longer needed to hide and grew much more powerful than any human nation. They were immortals who were stronger and richer, and some even had supernatural abilities, and they could quickly produce more science compared to the traditional primal and slow human reproduction. They also had no morality or religious baggage and ventured into many scientific areas that humans failed to conquer, including DNA engineering and body alteration. Nowadays, the human beings living in Eternia were slaves, pets and livestock. They were murdered, eaten, raped, and tortured every day just for some vampire's amusement. And Julian, he was well sheltered all his life, and his soul was too soft and gentle. Besides, he was too pious and also probably not gay. Lucius wouldn't know for sure since Julian had never had any romantic relationship before he entered the seminary, but the churches condemned homosexual activities. Asking him to marry the very incarnation of evil and serving him sexually would be a fate worse than death. He couldn't survive Eternia. Lucius might be jealous of the affection Julian received from their parents and pretty much everyone else, but he still loved his twin brother, and he didn't want him to suffer. And Lucius, he might be frivolous, troublemaking, and drank too much, but he knew he was tougher. Besides, how many people would miss him if he was gone? He had no boyfriend, and no significant others. All his friends would sell him in a blink of an eye. He could stop a war and save his brother from a terrible fate. It was a good deal. Could he really live with himself if he chose to flee, knowing he was sentencing Julian to a horrifying death? Lucius cursed loudly, knowing he didn't really have a choice. He collapsed into the armchair, resigning. "No. I'll stay." Imelda didn't appear to be surprised. "Are you sure?" "Yes. You are a fool, you know that." She sighed profoundly. "Maybe." Lucius gave her a wry smile, "but at least now I feel like it is a choice I made." "Thank you. I know the escape plan is probably not real, and you are just tricking me since you know me so well. You knew I would have chosen to stay. But still, you make me see the whole picture better." Watching the color gone on Imelda's face, Lucius knew he guessed it right. Imelda might be caring for him, but she would never risk sacrificing Julian. There was never any escaping plan. Lucius the First. "It's okay, sister." Lucius closed his eyes, suddenly feeling even more exhausted than before. "I will eat and learn the etiquettes and play my part. Is there anything else? I'm really tired. I didn't lie to you when I said I didn't agree to this. It's just, we don't have a choice." Imelda's sorrowful voice would have moved the hardest heart, but Lucius just couldn't process it anymore. Ere long, Lucius heard the sound of the door opening and then closing. He opened his eyes. He looked around, feeling a bit cold. He was all alone once more. Lucius hated airplanes. No matter how much statistics suggested it was the safest way of traveling, he just couldn't help but imagine the worst scenario. How scared the passengers must be when they knew it was going down and they would die in a few minutes, no time to process and to make peace. Before they boarded it, they were probably planning what to do during their vacation or what to eat as supper, having no inkling that they would never make the destination. However, he was much calmer than usual this time, probably because what was awaiting him on the other side of the journey was worse than his worst fear about planes. After 2 martinis, the head bodyguard escorting Lucius to Eternia forbade the stewardess to bring him more, so he had to suffer the whole trip and the following ordeals sober. Plus, the rigid crimson robe, a typical formal attire high priests wear, was extremely cumbersome and uncomfortable. He wondered how Julian could wear such complicated and restricting clothing every day. He tried to watch some movie or listen to music, but the chaotic thoughts roaring in his head prevented him from enjoying any of it. He wondered if there was any morsel of remorse in his parents' hearts. Would Imelda regret that she tried to trick him into compliance? Would the people of Anther know that he was the oblation of the so-called peace? And most of all, would Julian miss him? Would he weep for him? And why didn't he try to contact or talk to him since the farce commenced? Why didn't he come to say goodbye? Was it guilt or fear? Did he know about the premise of the treaty at all, or did they keep him in the dark? And if he knew, did he agree to this? Lucius thought he knew the answer, but he was no longer sure after being sold by his parents and his country. In 3 hours, they landed in Imberton. As the plane glided to a stop, Lucius looked outside the window and saw figures in black suits waiting next to a long, black limousine. They looked just like regular humans from afar. Lucius felt nauseated. The stewardess was practically shaking as she opened the cabin door. Lucius could smell the fear and uneasiness from underneath all his bodyguard's collected demeanor. Even the head bodyguard Dan, who allegedly killed 3 apostle vampires during his serving time, appeared unsettled. "Are you ready?" asked Dan. Lucius combed his shoulder-length hair a few times with his sweaty fingers and straightened his robe and sash as he stood up, trying to look as presentable as possible. From now on, he had to stop being Lucius and become Julian. But how long could he last? Was it possible to pretend someone he was not for the rest of his life? "I wish you'd let me have that one more drink," he mumbled before standing up and walking toward the exit. 6 vampire guards stood straight and silent on either side of the air stair, 3 men and 3 women. Probably all neophytes or above since they were not afraid of the sunlight. They were youthful, slim and elegant, with cooler-toned, immaculate skin and rich, lustrous hair. The only thing that gave away their predatory nature was when their piercing gaze locked on you. The covetous lust for killing, blood, and cruelty slithered out from the eerie glistens of their unblinking eyes, making the ones under their gaze shudder instinctively. It was the first time Lucius came so close to vampires, and every hair plus the goosebumps on his body stood erect. His steps slowed down haltingly as the urge to run became harder to suppress. But Dan put a hand on his back, and the forceful pressure pushed him forward. A tall, black-haired vampire woman walked up to them with a glamorous smile, revealing two long, sharp fangs. "Welcome to Eternia, Your Holiness. I hope the flight was pleasant." Everyone could hear the sarcasm as she spoke the term, Your Holiness, as in their mind, the famous, the angel of God, would soon become their crown prince's whore, and it must feel satisfying to defile the whole country's belief. Little did they know all they were getting was a downgraded copy of the authentic one. Thought Lucius with dark, self-deprecating humor. She opened the limousine door for Lucius, but as Dan tried to follow, two vampire guards stopped him. "The reception is finished. We will take His Holiness to Vermilion Citadel from here," the woman curtly said, gesturing to the plane. Apparently did not plan to provide any unnecessary hospitality to a man known for killing 3 of their precious apostle vampires. Dan looked at Lucius with concern because if they left now, Lucius would have to face whatever came next alone. It would come sooner or later, but Lucius still felt panic rise once more to his throat. He managed to nod to Dan, permitting him to leave him here, as he knew there was nothing else they could do. As the car drove away, Lucius looked back and saw the guards were still standing there. They were likely the last person from Onther he would see for a long, long time, making his eyes swell and painful as he tried to press down the wetness. The limousine soon dove into the heart of Eternia. It was the hour of sunset, the vampires, early morning. The intricate, archaic streets appeared quiet and forlorn, sealed into the resin of roseate twilight, beautiful and almost peaceful. The ancient capital was a concoction of antiquities and vanguards, a jarring between two extremes yet fitted perfectly. Heavy, stately columns and heavenly arches adorned each stunning building, yet colorful augmentative projecting ads, sleek automated cars, and cleaning bots were easily spotted everywhere. There was no sight of homeless people or even a piece of garbage. Everything was clean and fresh and flaunting luxury. And Vermilion Citadel was the heart of the everlasting capital, a magnificent and ancient edifice erected at the center of Emberden and could be seen half city away. It was a Gothic castle built with a kind of volcanic stone with a florid ruby hue, symbolizing the color of blood. As the limousine approached the gate, the last ray of twilight shone on the giant rose window, which glistened alluringly. Many vampires were staring at the limousine as they passed by. Probably all knew well of the key passenger. The car went past the tall black front door of the main building and went all the way to one of the side entrances, and there were several vampires in fine black morning suits lined up on both sides. Each wore a cold and rigid expression. One of the footmen opened the door for Lucius, and another prim man with salt and pepper hair stood in front of him. "Welcome to Eternia, Your Holiness. I am the head steward, Harold Sheridan." Lucius quickly scanned around. All the vampire servants were expressionless, but their nostrils were flaring, and some were gulping as if seeing a delicious dessert, and their glare contemptuous. Lucius knew how perilous his situation was even though he was to be the crown prince's consort. He was just a bag of blood to them, and any of them could have torn him apart in a blink of an eye. When one was surrounded by predators, the worst thing one could have done was to show fear. So Lucius mustered up all of his courage, straightened his back, slightly raised his chin, and extended his right hand that wore the high priest's ruby ring, which was one of the rings that Julian wore every Tuesday, palm facing down, and waited. A gesture was universally commending the other party to kiss his ring and show subordination. It was a bold move, and the steward paused for a second. But soon, he bowed his head, and bended down to kiss the ring. "Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Sheridan," said Lucius, trying his best to maintain an even, authoritative tone. "I am responsible for preparing you for the wedding tonight. Please follow me." Lucius was guided through the imposing hallways and colonnades with several servants and guards trailing. Every person passing by was staring at him while chittering or laughing without much dissimulation. Each pair of gazes was a pair of needles nipping at Lucius's back, and anxiety scratched the inside of his skin like thousands of crawling worms. Occasionally human slaves appeared behind their vampire masters. All of them wore collars with a leash attached to the front. Some of them were completely naked and crawled on the ground like dogs. Many of them were adorned with jewelry, and their body was maintained in great shapes like the models in the magazines, albeit scattered with wounds and bruises. And to Lucius's surprise, some of them looked at their masters in such an infatuated way as if they were madly in love with their tormentors, and even as their masters punished them, their moans were like pleasure more than pain. Lucius heard many horror stories about how vampires tortured their human slaves for fun. One time, he visited Julian when the latter was helping in a refugee center for all the human slaves escaped from Eternia, and he saw all those scared, deformed, and scrawny men and women, some of them dead than live. One of the girls barely had any skin left, as if she was eaten by a pack of wolves and left behind a skeleton with a thin layer of muscle and scarred tissue. Julian told him that some vampires not only liked to drink blood but also bit and tore flesh like ravenous wolves. And if some vampire masters tired of their slaves, they would feed them to the most primal type of vampires, namely beasties, which were more like ferocious animals than a sentient being. He didn't know how far was he from being attacked and eaten. To ensure your safety, please refrain from walking these hallways alone. As if reading his mind, Sheridan said nonchalantly, I don't think anyone would dare to lay a hand on you, but just for precaution, please always bring a guard. And what if my guard attacks me? That is impossible. All guards in Vermilion Citadel are selected by Prince Dorian and are well trained, including controlling their urge to feed. They wouldn't touch you even if they starve, given that it is Prince Dorian's will that you are not to be harmed. Which means if he displeased his future husband and lost his favor, Dorian could easily get rid of him and get one of his loyal guards to take the blame. The next few hours went by fast. Lucius was brought into a luxurious room and was asked to take off all of his priest attires, as he was no longer the high priest of Onther. Lucius complied without much dispute as it was not his clothing anyway. He wasn't allowed to bring anything of his own as he was supposed to be Julian. Then Lucius was guided to a huge bathroom with an ancient Roman caldarium pool. The water was heated perfectly, and a human eunuch servant insisted on giving him a scalp massage as he was soaking in the water, and it felt so good that he almost felt relaxed. After the bath, 2 other human women put rose scent oil on him and then dressed him in an exquisite embroidery dark red velvet tunic, matching dress pants, a ruffled diaphanous white silk shirt and a bow tie with a dainty ruby brooch. Several maids fussed over his hair to make it curled loosely elegant. He felt like he was being packed and adorned like a dessert. All the while, someone was reading Lucius' court etiquettes and the wedding procedures, and he had to memorize everything within 2 hours. By the end, Lucius already began to have a pretty bad migraine, for he hadn't studied so intensely since uni finals. You know, you could have sent these to me like a month earlier, so I have time to prepare. Lucius was so frustrated and pissed that he forgot about his fear of vampires and bitched loudly at Sheridan. And the latter only smiled and reassured him that even if he forgot about something, someone nearby will remind him. The hour finally came, and Lucius soon found himself standing outside a heavily ornate door, waiting to enter the grand throne room as the crown prince consort. He was lightheaded, couldn't grasp the weight of reality, feeling as if he was in a dream. A very bad, very long dream. And then, the imperial organ music grew louder, and the door slowly opened. The wedding began at midnight, and Imberton was bathed in splashy neo lights, huge and vivid AR projections of live streaming of the wedding, and a din of thousands of people gathering in front of the vast space before Vermilion Citadel, trying to take a peek of the royal wedding. Elder vampires arrived at the palace one after another in luxury cars to attend the wedding and the banquet. Beautiful people dressed in panoplies were posing on the red carpet for the flashing cameras. Some even brought their half-naked human slaves to taunt the new war-spoil consort that their prince would claim tonight. It was probably the greatest celebration of the year so far, and yet, the protagonist of the charade didn't see any of these. He stood forlorn in front of the giant door while 2 guards stood next to him. Sheridan appeared from a side door and came to Lucius's side. Most of the guests have arrived. The ceremony will start soon. Do you need to drink some water? You look a little pale. Not as pale as you, I should hope. Jibed the human. Sheridan smiled. It's very understandable if you are nervous. Do not worry. Prince Dorian is one of the most good-looking men in this country. Oh, I do not worry about that. You vampires are all rather good-looking. Lucius swallowed and tried to quash his frantic heart. I only hope that he is not cruel. Cruelty is a relative term. He will treat you well if you try your best to please him. Sheridan's quiet reassurance didn't do much to assuage Lucius's nerves. But it would have to do as the organ music began to play. What's with the obsession with organs? Almost all vampire music had that instrument, thought Lucius absent-mindedly, and then the door was opened, and resplendent light poured out like a toppling tide. In front of him was a long passage of black carpet covered in red rose petals. Thousands of candles irradiated the vast throne room, and on each side, countless vampire nobles gathered, and they all turned toward him, hearing the door was opened. Stretching their neck, trying to see the holiest man of their strongest foe falling from grace. Lucius kept his eyes straight and tried not to notice those prickling gazes and malicious chatters. He was not used to all this attention, and though he had wished to be seen more by people around him when he was younger, presently, he only wanted to disappear in thin air. And at the end of the long walk was the throne sitting on several stairs, and King Cosmos of Eternia sat solemnly. It was said he was one of the oldest vampires, the son of the first vampire, King Edward Ashdown, yet he still looked handsome and strong in his 30s. And at the bottom of the stairs stood a man. His Persian blood gave him rich raven hair, deep-set, alluring black eyes, and lustrous sun-kissed skin. He was dressed in full black with gold embroiders hemming the edges of his waistcoat. And his posture was straight and dignified. Though merely standing, there was an ineffable aura of danger, depravity, majesty, and a covert form of seduction about him that drew everyone in like a black hole sucking in light. And that was the Crown Prince of Eternia, Dorian Ashdown. His name was not unfamiliar to all people in Onther, as he was the commander of all eternal armies in the recent war. People in Onther hated and feared him, seeing him as the incarnation of the devil. There were many rumors about him. Some said he liked to eat human children. Some said he did experiments on all the captives and had a sacred room full of twisted human bodies. And some said he enjoyed hearing men's screams while he ate dinner. But as Lucius laid eyes on him, he couldn't help but forget all the horrible stories about him for a short while and was astonished by his devilish beauty. And Dorian was also gazing at him, a smile hinged on the lip corners. Lucius couldn't tell if the smile was genuine or not. He walked up to his side, trying hard not to avert his gaze as Dorian kept peering at him. Lucius had that dreaming feeling once again. It was his wedding, possibly the most important occasion in his life, yet he felt like a stranger. The vampire wedding was similar to human weddings, except for certain strange traditions. They had to bite on their own wrist and pour their blood into 2 small crystal vials, seal them, and exchange them with each other. And then, they had to stand in a circle with runic symbols carved into the ground and vow to be faithful and loyal to each other. Lucius was pleased that he said his vow unerringly, given that he had only memorized it 2 hours ago. As the king pronounced them husbands and husbands, the throne room was inundated by cheers and music. The king appeared to be offish and disinterested, though he still gave Dorian a nod. May this marriage bring us peace and prosperous as you hoped. Lucius could hear the satire between those words. So the king did not agree to this marriage. Dorian bowed reverently toward his father king. When have I ever let you down? Father. The king grunted as he glanced at Lucius. It was a strange look, and Lucius almost imagined he saw pity in those red-tinted brown irises as someone looked at a cattle that was going to be sent to the slaughterhouse. And then Lucius looked back at Dorian, and for a moment, the smile on the prince's lips slipped, and a brief coldness fleeted across his sculptural countenance. Throughout the wedding and the banquet, Lucius hadn't a chance to speak a word to his husband, for everything went by fast and chaotic and noisy. Vampires' feast was every inch true to their reputation. Every ambrosial was bathed in blood, and naked entertainers presented extremely suggestive performances while the nobles drank and laughed and even touched and kissed and undressed their slaves and lovers in public shamelessly. Even Lucius, who was not a stranger to parties and debauchery, felt awkward and uneasy. He didn't dare to touch any food or drink, thinking it was all made with human blood. And soon hunger was roaring in his belly. He could only hope that the loud music concealed the rumbling sound. You can eat some fruits. They are clean, no blood. Lucius jolted and turned his head. A very handsome man was standing next to him, handing him a plate of assorted fruits. The man's appearance resembled some similarity to Dorian, except with longer hair and softer features. Lucius recalled information that an agent imparted to him before his departure and surmised this was Dorian's younger half-brother, son of Cosmos's favorite concubine Lady Divina, Prince Sylvan. According to the agent, Dorian and Sylvan had a rather strained relationship, for Dorian and his mother were exiled to Levanon because of Lady Divina's false accusation that the former queen had poisoned her daughter. And though Dorian later managed to clean his mother's name, the vampire queen had passed away when Onther took hold of Levanon several years ago. After returning from exile and being reintroduced to the court, Dorian was unexpectedly civil and amiable to Lady Divina, yet there was always an undertone of competition between Dorian and Sylvan, as they were both considered potential heirs to the throne. Dorian's position was not as solid as it appeared. He was appointed as crown prince only because of the king's guilt toward his ex-queen. Some said the living lover could not compete with a dead one, as memories were always the sweetest. But since King Cosmos didn't punish Divina at all for her treachery against the queen, how long would it take for her to whisper some poisonous honey into his ear and turn him against his first son? All the information quickly flashed across Lucius's mind, and he smiled politely toward Sylvan, accepting the plate. "You are very thoughtful, Prince Sylvan." "You recognize me," said the prince surprisingly. "You and your brother often make the news of my country. And someone like you too is hard to forget." Sylvan raised one side of his brow and chuckled, "Be careful, your holiness. If not knowing you were a high priest, I'd thought you were flirting with me." Lucius secretly chided himself for forgetting he was supposed to be his pious and bashful brother and not his frivolous self. He maintained his cool and replied, "I'm only stating the fact. How to interpret it is on you, your highness." Sylvan tilted his head and studied him with great interest. "I thought priests are pretty dull and boring. You seem different, though. How many priests have you seen, given they lived long enough for you to know them?" Sylvan laughed amusingly, and then his eyes flickered to somewhere on the other side of the room, noticing Dorian was glancing in their direction, observing their interaction tacitly. The younger prince's smile went a bit wider. He picked up a strawberry, dipped in the dark chocolate sauce, and put it next to Lucius's lips. "Try these. There is no blood in them, they are very sweet and delicious. I hate seeing the new groom starving in his wedding banquet." Lucius tried to take the strawberry with his hand, but Sylvan retracted a little and moved it closer to his mouth. Lucius frowned. Such behavior was rather intimate, but then, maybe it was a norm in the vampire world. Compared to the orgy happening in one corner of the room, feeding a strawberry to someone else was only too vanilla. He hesitantly opened his mouth, and took a bite. Just then, someone cleared his throat behind him. Lucius turned and saw Dorian was there, glaring at him darkly. He was way taller when he stood closer, and Lucius felt like he was being pressed down into the floor by his shadow. "Dear brother, your companion is looking for you. Leaving a lady alone in a banquet is not very courteous," Dorian said in a deep, magnetic voice. Sylvan smirked. "I should say the same to you, brother. You shouldn't have left your very lovely consort here all by himself. Beware all the staring eyes. What if someone whisks him away? I appreciate your concern for my consort. I will indeed always keep an eye on him." Dorian then moved his attention back to a nervous Lucius. The crown prince squinted his eyes, then put a big hand on his chin, tilted his face up, and leaned in. Before Lucius could understand what was happening, something soft, wet, and demanding swept against his lip corner. Dorian let go of his chin while tasting something in his mouth. "You had some chocolate there," he whispered huskily and seductively. "I cannot wait to taste you more thoroughly when we return to our room." Lucius goggled at him, stunned. Words had failed to come to his lips. Then hotness spread under his cheek instantly. And then Dorian straightened his back and announced, "My consort and I will retire for the night. Please continue to enjoy the food and the wine without us. The night is still young." And in the rumbling, laughing and cheering, Lucius's mind was completely black as Dorian took his wrist and pulled him out of the ballroom. Chapter 5 The Wedding Night. Lucius stood in Dorian's bedroom like a lost lamb as the doors closed behind him. The slamming sound jolted him a little. The room was spacious but dimly lit, and a light musk scent fermented the air. A giant 4-pole bed already made by the servants. Lucius turned around and was startled by the closeness of the vampire prince. In the obscure light, something ominous and dark was expanding on his shadowy countenance, making Lucius's stomach twist in disquiet. "Your Highness, I..." Before he could finish, a powerful hand clutched his shirt and threw him onto the bed like a ragged doll. Lucius yelped in surprise and fear, and before he could prop himself up, a heavy body loomed over him and pinned him down like an unmovable mountain. Dorian gazed down upon him like a beast about to take his first bite, and the coldness in his dark irises made Lucius shudder. "No need to continue your charade. I know you are not him," said the prince in a contemptuous snarl. Just like that, all the courage that Lucius tried to muster up for the past month sundered to pieces. They didn't even have a chance to talk. How come he knew already? Lucius didn't expect to fail his mission so quickly, and for a moment, his mind was blank except for one word: shit. "You are his twin brother, aren't you?" Dorian's finger trailed along his eyebrow and cheekbone. "Even though you look just like him, your smell is different, and I can tell at the moment you walked toward me in the ceremony." Do your cunning prime minister and that fatuous king really think such trickery can fool me? The smell. But how did Dorian know Julian's smell? Did they meet before? Then why no one told him so? Lucius's thoughts churned rapidly as he replied in panic, "What are you talking about? I'm Julian Rosenfield. Stop lying." Dorian pounded the bed furiously right next to Lucius's face, and Lucius squeezed his eyes shut as he trembled. Would he die on his wedding night? "I'm not lying. My name is Julian Rosenfield." Technically he was telling the truth since his parents had changed his official name before Arthur accepted the treaty conditions. Dorian's nostrils flared in anger, his fangs protracted longer, and his body seemed to grow larger and stronger with all the muscles bulging, heavily pressing Lucius into the bed. "Why are you still trying to cover for them? They send you here to be my whore so they can protect the high priest, don't you know? Or do you prefer the role since you are already used to being a whore, based on your reputation?" Lucius couldn't breathe from the weight on him, yet listening to the words fall from the prince's mouth hurt even worse. He struggled to retort, "If you are so sure, why didn't you expose me and break the treaty in the ceremony?" Dorian bared his teeth as he answered in spite, "Because I don't want to be humiliated in front of everyone in the court and become a joke for the next decade." Quote, "So you'd rather marry a whore, rather than the holy and pure high priest you want so much just to save your face?" Jibed Lucius. Probably not a good idea, but he couldn't help it, and the way Dorian glowered at him made Lucius think the vampire would rip his throat out in the next second. But the weight on him suddenly lifted. Dorian stood straight and regarded him with such repugnance that made Lucius feel worthless. "Get off my bed. Tonight you will sleep on the couch." Lucius blinked in confusion and hesitated for a second. But Dorian didn't have much patience for him. "Go on, get off. I'm not interested in fucking an imposter." Lucius's face reddened in mortification. It was ironic since Lucius had been dreadful about consummating the marriage, but now that the prince didn't even want to touch him as if he was something dirty, he felt so much worse. He bit back the retorts, knowing it won't be wise to infuriate Dorian more. But why did the vampire have to be such an asshole? It was not like he wanted this. Lucius scrambled out of bed and went to the couch. He figured that Dorian still wanted other people to believe that they had spent the night together, which meant the prince was hesitant to break the treaty for some reason. He sat on the couch, noticing Dorian was taking off his clothes and preparing for sleep. And though he hated this man for belittling him throughout the whole night, he couldn't deny how attractive Dorian was. Those beautiful curves of the 8-pack muscles on his abs, the streamlined mermaid lines, the soft light trickling across his velvety sun-kissed skin. If there were an incarnation of Lucius's wettest dream, this would be it. Dorian felt his gaze and leered at him annoyingly. "What?" Lucius blushed as he was caught staring. He cleared his throat. "Do you have an extra blanket?" Dorian rolled his eyes, peeled off the blanket on top of the comforter, and threw it over Lucius's head. Lucius murmured a thank you, took off his tunic and slid under the blanket. However, Lucius couldn't fall asleep. It was 8 in the morning, and he was not used to vampires' schedule. Even though the heavy drapes shielded the sunlight and he was exhausted, his body still told him it was time to rise and shine. Besides, how could he find a trance of sleepiness when the other person in the room was a vampire that might go into a blood frenzy and suck him dry, and he could do nothing to stop it? He tried to get up quietly and find something to do, maybe find a book or a tablet so he could watch a movie, but as he was sitting up, Dorian's grumpy voice came from the bed. "What are you doing?" Lucius cursed silently. "I can't sleep. Try count sheep. Can I just read a book by the window? I will be quiet." "No, lie down." Pissed at Dorian's domineering tone, Lucius didn't obey but tried to stand up, but then Dorian's voice got darker. "Lie down, or I will bite you. Our venom has a certain soporific effect." Lucius froze. "You can't do that. It was in the treaty. And yet they send me a fake Julian." Dorian propped his body up to look at Lucius. "I only promised not to turn you against your will. Merely biting you won't turn you into a vampire." Lucius pouted for a short while and decided not to take the risk. He lay back on the couch and stared into the heavily ornate ceiling. He wasn't sure if Dorian was asleep or not. He couldn't even hear his breath. What would Dorian do to him in the morning? Would he keep the front or tear him apart? The latter was relatively unlikely as he wouldn't have been alive now should Dorian want to break the treaty. But why wouldn't Dorian wish to break the treaty? Eventually, Lucius fell asleep at some point during the day and was awakened by a strange noise. Someone was moaning. Lucius sat up and looked at the bed, and his eyes widened. Dorian crawled on the bed, and the comforter was draping from his waist. A beautiful tattoo of a gloomy mountainous landscape covered almost his back. The muscles underneath the tattoo moved and undulated, and a thin layer of rosy red seeped out from the dark skin. And his wavy hair fell from his forehead, covering his eyes and his blushing face. Albeit the essential part was shielded by the cover, it wasn't hard to make out what he was doing. Dorian was pleasuring himself. Lucius blinked in astonishment, but he didn't look away. The scenery was too beautiful to look away from. If Dorian didn't mind performing such an astounding act in front of him, he would not let it go to waste, no matter how much of an asshole the prince was. And as he observed shamelessly, an amorous heat was also growing inside his body. And as Dorian's moan grew louder and eventually culminated into a deep growl, Lucius shivered, almost wishing himself was the one that made him growl like that. But that was a stupid thought, especially when he heard the vampire mutter a name. It was faint and damped, but Lucius found the name eerily similar to Julian. He must know Julian, thought Lucius. But when, and under what occasion? As far as Lucius knew, Julian had been sheltered well and had never been exposed to dangerous situations like nearing a murderous vampire. Dorian panted for a few moments and then threw the cover back, revealing his fully naked, sculptural body. He stretched himself a little, pulled on a pair of shorts and then turned his eyes to Lucius nonchalantly. That was quite a show, Lucius commented blatantly. And you obviously enjoyed it. Dorian leered at him as he buttoned up a shirt. Come here. Lucius didn't move. Must I repeat every single one of my commands? I thought you at least wouldn't be dumb since you are Julian's twin. And how did you know Julian? That's none of your concern. Now, come here. The tone of the prince got more serious and dangerous, and Lucius knew he better comply. He stood up from the couch and took a few steps. Closer. I won't bite. Lucius inched closer cautiously. The smell of semen grew stronger, and he could see the stained bedsheet. He looked away. Oh, we are shy now, aren't we? Dorian scoffed. No need to pretend you are Julian if it's just us. It was not like he was faking the embarrassment. Lucius glared at him. What do you want? Dorian took a small knife from the nearby fruit tray and tossed it on the bed next to the stain. Cut yourself. What? Dorian sighed as if talking to a stupid child. If you don't want to restart the war, the servants who will be cleaning this room shortly have to be convinced that we consummated the marriage. And since Julian is a virgin, it is only logical to assume that he may hurt a little during our passionate lovemaking. Lucius rolled his eyes. And how do you know he is a virgin? He is one of the 5 high priests of your country, isn't he? They can't be high priests if they are not virgins. Okay, even if so, he doesn't have to bleed if you are a skillful and careful lover. Lucius crossed his arms. Well, the alternative is that you do the same as I did. Vampires have a keen sense of smell. They can tell if it was only my scent on this bed. I'm not going to masturbate in front of you. I'm not asking you to. Dorian glanced at the knife. Blood has the strongest smell of you and will distract them. Or, you can just leave the room, and I will do what you did, Lucius said sternly. Cutting is painful, and I hate pain. I can't leave. We have to leave this room together, and I have to take you to the dining room to meet the royal family on the first wedding night. Then go to the washroom. Dorian clicked his tongue and gave in. Fine. He walked toward the washroom door while saying, I thought you'd prefer to drop a little blood. And why do you think of that? Why do I have to harm myself when all I need to do is have some fun with myself, which I was already doing pretty much every morning? Lucius answered venomously. Or did you mistake me for my brother? Dorian answered by slamming the washroom door shut. Chapter 6 Meet. Lucius had never witnessed a murder before, even though Arthur and Eternia had been at war for years and had heard various versions of horror stories of how vampires butchered humans in horrendous ways. He never really saw it with his own eyes. And last night, though the vampires acted in various licentious and depraved ways, none of them killed any human slaves. Even when they drink, they will stop before their victims lose too much blood. Therefore he was not prepared to handle the slaughter that happened over breakfast. It all went well at first. The king was not present. Lady Davina and her 2 daughters were nice and courteous toward him. Sylvan had been exceptionally charming and smiled at him in a way that would have made any experienced social butterfly blush, which annoyed Dorian to no end. The cook prepared all the food in human food form. Biscuits and pancakes, smoothies and coffee. All made with the blood but less bloody, severing the association of the ingredient from its procuring method so the new human consort wouldn't be startled. On top of that, they also prepared blood-free human food specifically for him. Everything fell apart. Though, when Lady Davina's third child, Prince Archie, barged into the dining room like a hurricane and sat next to one of the princesses. "Where have you been?" Lady Davina exclaimed. "Your father asked where you were last night, and I didn't know what to tell him." "I was busy," said the youngest prince curtly. He was relatively unkempt compared to other princes and princesses and had a ruggedly handsome face and an impressively strong body, probably even taller than Dorian. "Too busy for a royal wedding," Dorian said calmly and coldly as he seeped blood from a wine glass. Archie glanced at him and then moved his attention to Lucius. And his gaze had such raw, primal maliciousness and avarice that was completely different from the other princes and princesses. It was the gaze a wolf had while staring at a rabbit. Lucius genuinely thought he would lunge across the table and devour him alive, making his heart pound in alarm. "The royal wedding of our crown prince and a piece of food. How romantic," Archie jibed. "Archie, manage your tongue," Lady Davina warned. Lucius frowned and leered at Dorian. The latter didn't show much emotion, but the temperature around him suddenly dropped several degrees. So it seemed not everyone was on board with such an unusual marriage, and there was definitely some tension between Dorian and Lady Davina's house. Archie didn't continue the squabble. He looked at the food on the table and scrunched his nose in disgust. "What is this garbage? I want some real food," the older Princess Loretta berated. "For the love's sake, Archie, stop making a fuss. Just because we have a human sitting at the table, we all have to go vegetarian." Archie retorted, turning to the footman, "Tell them to bring fresh meat." Lucius tensed up. He heard about the term, fresh meat, which meant a human bred for harvesting purposes, just like how humans breed pigs to eat. And when vampires drink fresh meat, they rarely stop until the meat is dead. Davina glanced at Dorian but didn't stop her son, and Dorian maintained his straight face and also didn't say anything. Lucius goggled at the crown prince. Archie's adamant about having fresh meat was an obvious act of taunting. An insult to the new crown prince consort and, therefore, an insult to Dorian himself. How could someone as proud as Dorian just take it? Soon a guard dragged a young man into the dining room. He barely passed 20, trembling in terror like a trapped deer. And as he saw Archie, he began to whimper and cry piteously and muttered something under his shaky breath. Archie yanked the chain connecting to the meat's collar and let the young man fall helplessly into his lap. He then pulled the young man's hair and slammed him onto the table. The meat yelped in pain and fear and cried even louder. Archie grinned satisfactorily, and as he leaned closer to the young man, his gaze fixated on Lucius. This one is an educated meat, probably a capture rather than a house breed. He is praying to your god, the prince said sarcastically as he forced the young man to look in Lucius's direction. "Look, your high priest is right there. Don't you want him to give you the last rite?" The young man widened his eyes as he recognized Lucius, probably mistaking him for Julian. And his eyes were brimmed with pleading and hope as if thinking Lucius could spare him from this fate. "That's enough." Dorian finally opened his mouth, and every light and candle in the dining room dimmed simultaneously. "You can have your meat in silence." "And why is that? Don't you want to give him some peace before he meets your lord, high priest?" As Dorian slowly stood up, the tension in the air was tautened as a sting about to break. The situation was going to escalate before Lucius suddenly said calmly, "It's okay. Everyone has the right to their last rite." Dorian leered at him with mild surprise. Before Lucius's departure, several archpriests were sent to Rosenfield Manor to teach him how to be a high priest, which included cramping 4 years of seminary curriculum into 1 week and intensely watching all footage of how Julian presided over various rituals and performing public services, imitating how he pronounced each word and practicing day and night until not even his parents could tell the differences. Lucius had never studied so hard in his life, and ironically the archpriests were impressed by how fast Lucius was able to pick up things, which was some kind of praise he was never able to obtain from their previous private tutors. It turned out he was very good at pretending to be his brother. Sadly no one knew that Dorian had met Julian before and could identify his scent from miles away. Lucius stood up, and his countenance was settled in an ineffable peaceful tenderness that would calm the most troubled souls. In an instant, he changed into another unearthly radiant being as he came around the table and walked up to Archie and the lamb about to be slaughtered, calm and determined as if nothing evil or dark in this world could touch him. He stood in front of the poor man and gently touched his cheek with his left hand. "What is your name, my child?" "Harvey Caldwell. I'm an Anthorian." Lucius nodded and used his right thumb to draw the eye of God on the young man's forehead. "May the omniscient Lord of love and mercy guide you with the light of Northern Star," wash off all your sins, pain and suffering, and receive your soul in his land of eternity. And then, following the standard prayer, he kneeled in front of the man, gently wiped away his tears, and said quietly, I am sorry that I cannot save you, but fear not, for the Lord will take care of you, and soon you will be welcomed by all the loved ones you've lost in his paradise. There will be no more fear, and in no time, you will be drinking ambrosia and laughing with your kin and angels and reminiscent of all the good old times. Eventually, we will meet again in his lordship's garden, and everything will be all right. Do you believe me? Yes, your holiness. Please pray for me. Lucius cupped the young man's head between his palms and said firmly, look at me and believe in what I said. The young man clutched his hands desperately. Just as Lucius began to pray for him in Latin, a gush of warm blood abruptly splashed all over him. He was caught in surprise and tasted the metallic sweetness in his mouth, and some blood even got into his eyes. Lucius's mind was blank, petrified witnessing such aghast brutality. Archie paused for a moment and let out a satisfying sigh, and grinned at Lucius. Sorry, it was a bit too prolix. Lucius didn't know what to do or what to say. It was too much. It could have been him. He was no different from this young man in these monsters' eyes. But then someone took his hand, and he heard a deep voice reverberating in his head. Don't look. Dorian was by his side, and then he was somewhere else. He didn't remember what happened in between. Presently he was in a warm and cozy room, sitting on a sofa, and Dorian was handing him a clean towel. Lucius blinked. Where are we? Dorian sighed and sat next to him, using the warm and damp towel to wipe the blood off his face, and his touch was surprisingly gentle. We are in a drawing room. You were in a shock, so I took you here to clean up. Lucius then began to notice that he was shaking. He tried to stop it but couldn't, as the body was reacting to a much more primal sensibility. Were you also a priest at some point? Dorian asked as he tried to pick some blood clogs out of Lucius's hair. Lucius scoffed. Of course not. You were just like him when you gave the last rite, Dorian remarked. Lucius wasn't sure if it was in his mind, but Dorian's countenance was much softer than before, as if he was looking at someone else through him. Bitterness expanded in Lucius's heart. Dorian was only nice to him because he was a good imitator of his brother. But then, again, what else was he expecting? Being his brother was his full-time job now, wasn't it? Do you really think they will send someone who couldn't even recite the scripture? He answered wryly. Do you believe in your God? Nope, Lucius answered without hesitation. Dorian raised his brows. And yet you gave that man a last rite. It only matters what he believes. I couldn't save him, and you were not going to. The best I could do for him is give him hope and die in peace. Lucius paused for a moment, trying to contain a sudden rush of emotion, but it was not so peaceful after all. This is how many of the vampires eat. I can't just forbid it because of you. Dorian put down the towel and went to pour a glass of whiskey, passing it to Lucius. Lucius gulped down the whiskey and let that warmth sink into his stomach. Feeling slightly calmed, he replied, he was taunting you by humiliating me since I'm your consort, and you allowed it. Do you have a scruple about displeasing Lady Davina or what? Is she having power over you? Been here for 1 day, and you have already tried to interpose in court intrigues. Tell me, did they instruct you to do anything else other than impersonate your brother? I'm not a spy if that's what you are asking. They didn't have time to train me up for that. Lucius rolled his eyes, which would have at least given my life a bit more purpose. Dorian peered at him dubiously for a moment and decided to drop the conversation. You can go back to our room and rest. I'm sure others will understand. But I suggest you do not go anywhere else without me. As you can tell, not everything will respect your status. He then turned to the door and prepared to leave. Dorian, Lucius called abruptly before he could dissuade himself. I know you didn't want me, but if you don't want this war between humans and vampires as I surmised, we have to work together. Dorian's step halted. However, he didn't reply before he opened the door and left. Consort, Chapter 7 Dangerous Game. 1 month after the wedding, Lucius only saw Dorian 5 times. After the breakfast, the Crown Prince deemed he had fulfilled the minimum requirement of keeping the appearance of a happily consummate marriage and went straight back into his old life, which Lucius was not a part of. With no honeymoon, public appearance, and royal family integration, plus being advised by the steward to stay in specific areas of the citadel and not to venture anywhere he was unfamiliar with, Lucius felt like he was a prisoner more than a consort, albeit living in an extremely lavished prison. The heavy security around him guaranteed his safety. The food was scrumptious, the rooms were ornate and cozy, and the clothes were extravagant. And if Lucius wanted, he could have any kind of enjoyment he could think of and live a comfortable and frivolous life just as before. But he couldn't. There was something he had to accomplish, and he couldn't do much if Dorian ignored him for the rest of his life. One day he was sitting behind some exuberant rosebushes in the garden, trying to read an overly heavy and boring book about vampire history and trying not to fall asleep, and he heard two meandering nobles chattering and gossiping on the other side. "I bet the crown prince has already gotten tired of his holy bride. He isn't even showing him to the public." The other voice snickered, "This whole marriage is a farce. It would be fun to fuck and drink a virgin priest, but why would anyone want to marry them? They must be boring to death. If he wants to humiliate the humans, he could have just fucked him publicly and then sucked him dry." Some said he is sympathetic to humans. No way, humans killed his mother, and he was the one who vanquished Onther and their alliance's army. I don't believe those rumors. Anyway, I bet he will divorce the high priest and throw him into some slave house in less than 2 months. Then we can all get a taste of that holy blood, in his pretty ass. Ha ha ha, I would love to see that little innocent face stained by tears and pleading for mercy. I would certainly film the whole thing and put it online for the humans to see how their beloved angel of the Lord is defiled by the demons. You are such an evil bastard. So are you. Lucius's face was reddened with anger, yet he didn't make himself known. He had deserted the guards for a couple of hours of quiet and alone time, and he wouldn't impolitically expose himself in front of 2 hostile creatures of the night. But then he knew this day would come when Dorian stopped showing up 3 days after their wedding. He was a human consort who had no power in this place and was barely kept alive by the name of the marriage. The moment when the rumor of a divorce rose in the darkness, he would become common prey among the wolves. He had to do something about the situation. For the next few days, he tried to elicit answers about Dorian's whereabouts from the valet and servants and yielded no good result, as they barely told him anything except for some very general prevarications. He requested to see the crown prince and only received some curt reply saying that Dorian was preoccupied with meetings and other stately matters. Not other nobles tried to pay him visits, as they all saw him as a temporary placeholder for the consort's position and wouldn't last too long. They believed Dorian married him just to humiliate Onther and buy some respite so they could focus on dealing with their more perilous werewolf problem on the Eastern Front. Running out of ideas, Lucius felt like he had to think of something out of the box and, possibly stupid and mad. He spent more time wandering in the citadel during sunset hours, always ensuring the 2 guards that Dorian assigned were with him. Many vampires gazed at him, and only very few greeted him. He took his time to put names on several regular faces and then researched their backgrounds online. Eventually, he locked his attention on a gardener, Faith. She was a vegetarian and had no human slaves, suggesting she might be more sympathetic to humans. On top of that, she had served in the royal family longer than Lucius had been on Earth and probably had witnessed or heard many affairs. Most importantly, she was turned into a vampire later in her mortal years and thus was less youthful than the other dazzling ladies in court. Therefore, in a heavily lookism-dominated vampire world, she was almost invisible. It wasn't too hard to befriend her. Lucius made sure he always went for a walk during her working hours and always greeted her with a Julian signature disarming smile. A smile that he had been practicing every day in front of a mirror since he accepted his fate, and he had found it was an exceptionally handy weapon. In less than a week, he had harnessed myriad valuable information from the all-seeing gardener, including some insight into vampire society and culture that was hard to find on any human-reachable network. But most importantly, she knew all the important events that would take place in the near future and who would be on the guest lists. The nearest event suitable for Lucius's plotting would be Duke Theron's birthday party, held in the Rose Garden at midnight. Archie and Sylvan would be attending as they were good friends with the Duke, and Dorian had already sent word that he would be late for about 2 hours, as he had to go to a charity event before that. On the night, Lucius put on a white shirt and white pants, leaving 2 buttons open and revealing his collarbones. He looked into the mirror and tied his longer hair into a ponytail to show his neck better. And then he took a deeper breath, reassuring himself that everything would work out, that he wouldn't be murdered this evening. But he knew it would be a lie. He will likely be dead before sunrise and possibly in a horrible way. But maybe it wouldn't be too painful. Vampires' venom often gave their victim euphoria to ensure they wouldn't fight back too hard. He was scared shitless. Where would he go after death? He never really believed in the afterlife, as everything seemed too artificial and perfect. But thinking that he would dissipate into an everlasting nothingness made his stomach cram. He still had a full life ahead of him and so many things he wanted to do and places he wanted to go. But if he didn't try, he would surely not have much longer life left. At 1 a.m., he told the guards that he wanted to take a walk in the Eastern Garden, some distance from the Rose Garden. The guards believed that the East Garden was far enough from where the party was taking place and agreed to accompany him. By then, Lucius had his own knack for shirking the guards since those guards had become less alarmed as Dorian stopped coming back to their room. He got rid of the guards when he entered the labyrinth, quickly exited from another exit, and moved toward the Rose Garden as stealthily as possible. He could hear the loud music, jovial laughter and clamor from the party from afar. He hid behind taller bushes and saw Archie laughing loudly with some of his friends, already half drunk from all the blood cocktails. Soon Archie left the crowd to release himself. And as he walked several rows of bushes further and was unzipping his pants, his ear caught some murmuring sound in the wind, almost musical, like a gentle crooning. He followed the voice, turned around another row of rose bushes and saw a small pound glistening under the moonlight. And near the pound, a figure was kneeling on the mossy ground, facing north and praying. Moonlight trickled over his red-tinted blonde hair as if forming an angelic aura, and the alabaster skin on his long neck was almost translucent under the moonlight. He was praying to the northern star as the starlight twirled in his hazel irises, stirring all kinds of kaleidoscopic colors. And his youthful countenance held such weight of determination and innocence, making him otherworldly. Archie gulped, and an unrestrained desire burst into flame. He could smell the blood rushing through the slender body, so sweet, pristine and nutritious. The blood of an angel. Look's what I found. My brother's little pet. He spoke the words like a low growling. Lucius was startled, and his prayers interrupted. He looked at the predator with those alluring big eyes wide open. Prince Archie. What are you doing here? Archie sauntered toward him slowly. His dark eyes fixed on Lucius, roaming in the darkness all by yourself, like a clueless little bunny. Lucius was tensed and skittish. He stood up and took a few steps back. I'm just saying my nightly prayer. There is no place for your puny god in Eternia, and he won't listen to you here. My brother should have kept a close eye on you. Or, maybe he just doesn't care about you anymore. I heard he hasn't been to your room for a month already. Perhaps he regrets the marriage and hopes someone can take care of you for him. Lucius's heart pounded loudly, and the frantic rhythm made Archie's blood boil. However, the prey was not toothless. Dorian is not a coward. He will own his action and deal with the consequences. Unlike you. The vampire's playful and drunken expression transmuted into something darker and colder. What's that supposed to mean? I am the crown prince's consort. Spouse of your future king. You should show me some respect. Lucius audaciously raised his chin, trying to bluff. And it successfully incensed the fractious and impulsive vampire prince. The next moment Lucius felt like being hit by a raging train. He was punched in the gut by such sheer brutal force that some bones must have been broken. He cried in pain but lost his voice as all his breath was knocked out of him, falling to the ground. Something gigantic and monstrous was on top of him. The vampire's body enlarged instantly, and thick, sinewy muscles bulged and tore the well-fitted fine clothes. His nails grew sharper and longer like 10 knives. His handsome features shifted into something demonic and beastly, and his teeth protruded into long, sharp fangs. Archie's giant hand slapped Lucius's face, and for a moment, Lucius couldn't hear, see, or think of anything. A loud ringing occupied all his senses. He was blacked out for a short while from that merciless blow, and when he came back, his shirts and pants were torn into pieces, and his naked body was covered in several angry long, deep claw marks. No, help. He only had a chance to utter 2 short cries before the monster grabbed his hair, pulled his head back, and sank his teeth into his neck. And then a strange sensation exploded in his body. Itchiness quickly spread through his veins and wrapped his mind in a foggy warmth. It was almost blissful and erotic. He knew the vampire venom was working in his system, and if he was seized by it, he would stop fighting altogether, which would be his end. He bootlessly pushed against the mountain-like body of muscles, feeling his strength quickly sucked out of him. Meanwhile, the giant hands roamed aggressively on his body, leaving bruises and scratches. He whimpered in fear and desperation when one hand forced his legs open and fumbled his private parts an opening roughly. Delicious. He hasn't even touched you, has he? Archie let go of his neck for a moment and gazed down at him with such smugness and covetousness, fully enjoying Lucius's trepidation and suffering. He will kill you for this. Let me go. Lucius panicked. It was not as he imagined. His strength failed him. He couldn't shout as the loudest voice he could make was like a weak cat cry. If no one heard him, this would be his humiliating end. I hope you know what happens to me here, mother and father. Lucius thought wretchedly, I hope you know what I've been through in Julian's place and regret. Though would they regret it? Or would they feel relieved that it was not their more precious son? Oh, little angel, I will be your first and last man. But don't worry, it will feel really good. Archie laughed loudly next to his ear, and his licentious tone made Lucius cringe and shudder. And then something black clashed with the monster on top of him and smashed Archie into a nearby tree, causing that tree to snap into two. It was an infuriating, wroth, blood-seeking Dorian. The crown prince's body also shifted. He was lean but taller and faster, like an enraged panther determined to rip his opponent apart. Archie tried to fight back, but his heavier body couldn't overpower Dorian's relentless attacks. Soon the crown prince held Archie's throat and pressed him into the dirt, forcing him to return to his original form. Meanwhile, a long jacket was warped around Lucius's bloody and naked body. Sylvan was on his side, pressing a hand against the wound on his neck. Lucius instantly clutched at the vampire's sleeve and refused to let go, as if scared of being left alone. Lucius was shaking violently and uncontrollably, his teeth were chattering as if he was extremely cold. Shish, it's okay now. You are okay. Sylvan's soothing voice barely contained Lucius's chaotic thoughts. On the other side, Dorian had returned to his original form, but he was still jamming his fist into Archie's face. Again and again and again, as if setting out to bash Archie's brains out. Dorian, please, Sylvan yelped, you should take care of Julian first. And that stopped Dorian's attack. The crown prince marched toward them, gently wrapped the jacket tighter around Lucius but carefully avoided all the wounds. Then he collected Lucius into his arms and carried him back to the citadel wordlessly. Chapter 8 The Classes of Vampires. Lucius was still shaking when Dorian took him back to their room and put him on the couch. His heart was thumping frantically, and no matter how hard he tried to breathe, the air refused to stay in his lungs. Look at me. Dorian's authoritative command pulled him back to his presence. Lucius focused his wild eyes on the vampire's unreadable countenance. Dorian stared into his eyes and his soul. An indomitable beam of power pierced Lucius's chaotic mind and transmuted into a cool mist of calmness, gingerly encompassing his thoughts like a shroud of protection. The panic subsided quickly, and Lucius was finally able to breathe again. Every inch of his body was in blazing pain, and his left cheek was swollen from the blow. Dorian tilted Lucius's chin and looked at the two terrible bites on his neck. His frown deepened. I will call a physician to check on you. No, Lucius finally spoke, I don't want them. Your wounds need to be treated, or they may get infected. Just give me some time. Lucius struggled to take a long deep breath. I just want to be alone for a moment, and then I will be fine, all right. Dorian studied him for a while and nodded. He stood up as if about to leave. Don't go, Lucius shouted in alarm. Dorian looked at him in perplex. I thought you wanted to be alone. Except for you, obviously. Lucius's voice broke a little. He cleared his throat awkwardly, trying to collect his composure. Can you just stay with me for a sec? Dorian raised one side of his eyebrows but turned back and sat next to Lucius. He didn't say anything, and he wasn't particularly nice to Lucius, but his presence strangely calmed Lucius's nerves. Why were you there? Dorian suddenly inquired. Just one question, and it strangely got on Lucius's nerves again. He snapped, are you seriously going to blame this on me? Your guards should have stopped you from going anywhere near that party. I didn't want them to follow. I want to be alone for just a few moments. Lucius retorted, am I your consort or a prisoner? So you lost them on purpose. Dorian squinted his eyes, you haven't answered my question. What were you doing there? I lost my direction after I came out of the labyrinth. Lucius knew Dorian didn't believe him, which was probably judicious on his part. But still, shouldn't his husband show more sympathy rather than interrogating him right away after he was almost violated and killed? This will happen again, you know. Lucius turned his face away from the crown prince, trying not to let the vulnerable emotions engulf him. If you want to divorce me, may as well just do it now and get it over with. I'm sure you can find a proper excuse. Who said I want to divorce you? Dorian frowned. Everyone. Lucius scoffed coldly. They have already been planning which slave house I should go to. Quote, don't be ridiculous. You were well protected. If you just do as you told and don't do stupid things like you did today, no one could have harmed you. And why was it so easy for me to lose your guard? Lucius pressed on. Why was your insubordinate brother so eager to defile your consort without qualm or hesitation? You never appear in public with me. Never even came to see me or try to introduce me to the court. You lived your normal life pretending that I didn't exist. I'm a human, a slave or livestock in vampires' eyes. You don't need to divorce me. All you need to do to get rid of me is give people the idea that you don't want me anymore, and they will rip me apart. Dorian glared at him. You are saying this is my fault. I'm just trying to understand what you want and what I am to you. Lucius said quietly, pulling the jacket around him tighter as if trying to look smaller. I know we tricked you, but why haven't you exposed me? Dorian stood up, went to the bar table nearby, and poured himself some drink, mixing it with a small portion of blood. Ere long, he replied, I don't want to continue the war. But why? The werewolves, insurrection, partially. Or, is it because of my brother? Dorian's movement paused for a long moment. He raised his eyes and leered at Lucius. Lucius pressed on, when did you two meet? He never mentioned anything, not even to me. It doesn't matter. Dorian answered offishly, but I admit that I've been neglecting your situation. You are my consort, and I should have treated you as such. That was what Lucius wanted to hear. He exhaled in relief and felt pain from the scratches rose again. He groaned in agony as blood soaked the jacket. Dorian called the physician and hesitated before asking, I can relieve it a little. How? Lucius winced. Every tiny movement worsened the pain. My venom. Hell no. I won't drink your blood, and you will feel better. Bite me and don't drink my blood. How ignorant do you think I am? You wouldn't be able to help yourself. It requires a great deal of restraint. Not all of us can do that. Dorian leaned against the armchair as his eyes lingered on the moonlight spilling near the window, and it's probably wise for you not to trust anyone who tells you that, though. Lucius knew he had no reason to trust Dorian, especially when the latter left him all alone in this cold, forbidding castle and showed no interest in his well-being until today. However, he also treated him with a degree of respect. He had every right to drink from or abuse him, just like everyone else around him wanted to do, but he didn't. And, he looked unnaturally beautiful under the moonlight. The glisten in his deep-set eyes looked almost gentle. I guess what can be worse, right? Lucius muttered, okay, I trust you. Just do your thing. Are you sure? Yes. I don't want to be awake at this moment, to be honest. Lucius inhaled shakingly. If possible, I don't even want to remember tonight. Dorian regarded him profoundly as he drew nearer. His alluring eyes mesmerized him even before he touched him. Then I should give you something better to remember, I suppose. Dorian's deep voice echoed in his brain like a chanting. He sat next to Lucius, putting one long arm around him and the other hand gingerly landed on his chin, tilting his head to one side. The prince's hot breath brushed against his skin, slithering into his ear. It almost felt like an affectionate embrace, and Lucius suddenly realized that he had never been embraced like this before. He had put on a charade of a rakish brat to give his parents some childish headache, but he never had the guts to follow through. All those quick dalliances and flirting were empty and pathetic, and he always wanted something more. Archie will pay for what he did to you, Dorian whispered before he bit down. The initial piercing pain quickly dissolved in a rush of dizziness, and that strange itchiness once again commenced spreading through his veins. It was like tiny feathers were growing under his skin, raising goosebumps and a sweet, tingling sensation. All the pain that plagued him was eased into that eerily erotic warmth. Lucius widened his eyes, and the world environed him was glowing. An irresistible pleasure was rising in his stomach, and he could tell he already had an erection. And then everything was foggy and distant. Lucius sat on that couch calmly and let the physician examine and treat his wounds. Dorian was always quietly present somewhere near, giving him a sense of security. Afterward, he fell into a long and deep slumber, and when he was awake, the wounds were almost gone. Even the worst ones were barely visible. Lucius was reluctant to leave the room for a few days. The thought of encountering another vampire was too dreadful. He supposed it was only normal after the terror of that night. He was already in much better condition than he anticipated. And one morning, when Lucius settled himself in the bed ready for sleep, hoping not to be plagued by nightmares, the door opened, and Dorian stepped in. They stared at each other in awkward silence. The moment Lucius lay eyes on that beautiful, dark and dangerous man. The sensation of the intoxication came back in full force, and he hoped the light was dim enough so Dorian wouldn't see his blushing. Lucius berated himself silently. Why was he acting like a young girl in a crush? It was not like they slept together. Dorian opened his mouth. I can sleep on the couch. Okay, Lucius mumbled. Dorian took off his shirt and went into the bathroom, and hearing the showing sound, Lucius couldn't restrain his imagination of how water was trickling down the curve of each muscle, caressing his sculptural, beardless chin and dampening his rich, raven, lustrous hair. Lucius quickly buried himself into the comforter and shut his eyes as the sound of water stopped, pretending to be asleep. He heard Dorian open the door and turn off the light, setting himself down on the couch. I want to take you on a trip. Dorian's voice disrupted the quietude. Lucius opened his eyes. What? There will be a negotiation with Nocturne happening in Etherfort. But before that, I need to pay Lord Dirchville a visit. He has been holding up the werewolf attacks for months now. You will be kept safe in his castle, but it will benefit us if people see you go to the front line with me. Lucius sat up abruptly. You want to take me to war? Only if you want to. Lucius pondered for a while. What do I need to do? I know very little about everything. I can teach you. The voice from the darkness was flat, and Lucius couldn't guess his expression. Okay, I want to go with you. Great. Dorian turned over on the couch and no longer spoke. For the next several days, Dorian kept his word and spent most of his time with Lucius in his study, introducing the 10 oldest vampire families, their descendants, and the division of different classes. Vampires are known for their strict and fixed social stratum as their level of sentient and abilities are tight with their classes. The lowest class is called the ogres, which are more similar to beasts rather than sentient beings. They are strong, fast, nocturnal, bloodthirst all the time, and are driven by primal instinct rather than rational thinking. Their lifespan is usually around 200 years, and their exceptional cell regeneration rate makes them immune to regular physical attacks. However, they will burn in the sunlight and can be hurt lethally by silvers and werewolf teeth. They cannot make any other vampires but can infect creatures they bite with a deadly madness similar to rabies. If they mate with each other, the offspring will also be ogres. The second class is called the neophytes. They comprise the majority of the vampire population. They possess all the preternatural abilities that ogres have and more. They are capable of hypnotization, hyper-olfaction and night vision, hyper-speed and often inherit one or two distinctive gifts from their makers. Their appearances are the same as humans except with 2 long retractable fangs. They are immortal unless killed by starvation, fire, dark arts, werewolf attacks, high concentrations of UV exposure and some direct energy weapons. Daylight will weaken them but won't harm them. The only kind of vampire they can make is ogres, and the offspring they reproduce are neophytes. The third class is the apostles. They are the nobles of the vampires, direct offspring of the 10 oldest elders. Except for the first generation, who were made by the elders, all were born vampires, and none were made. They often inherit many supernatural traits like shape-shifting, mind-controlling, invisibility, teleporting, etc. Many of them are masters of dark arts. However, their gifts are greatly affected by their elder bloodline. Sun does not affect them though they would prefer night over day. High concentrations of UV beams or some types of direct energy weapons could burn and slow them down but would not kill them. They can withstand long periods of starvation but would eventually fall into hibernation. And the only way to completely end their life is when their body is completely shuttered into dust, preventing them from resuscitating. Their offspring will also be apostles, and the vampires they make are neophytes. The last and the highest and also the most enigmatic class is the elders. The first 10 vampires were cursed into eternal damnation. They were powerful angels of God in the immemorial beginning of the universe but were punished for their pride and insubordination. Their existence has gradually faded into legend as no one had seen an elder for more than 3 centuries. They made the first generation of apostles, yet they seemed unable to produce any offspring. They were the ancestors of all vampires. So, which elder is your ancestor? Lucius asked with great interest. Dorian turned some brittle pages of the giant, archaic tome and pointed at a beautiful figure with raven hair and golden skin, 3 pairs of giant black wings spreading behind him. Azrael. The angel of death. The one who harvests souls. Dorian said reverently. He is beautiful. Lucius admired. So, he actually exists. As real as you and me. But how do you know that if no one has seen an elder in centuries? Because as our maker, every vampire is attached to them. And if they are harmed, We will all feel the pain. Lucius blinked. So hypothetically, if one of the 10 elders is dead, what would happen? I don't know. Some believe they cannot be killed. But if they can die, maybe 1/10 of us will die with them. Dorian said nonchalantly as if it was no big deal. Lucius widened his eyes. What? Aren't you worried that your life is attached to someone you don't even know where they are? It's a burden all vampires have to bear. Just like you, humans all will age and die, yet you still live your life as if it won't happen. That was, strangely and philosophically making sense. Lucius tilted his head and studied Dorian curiously. So, what's your family's special ability? Dorian was about to answer, but a knock on the door interrupted their conversation. Your Highness, the king requests your presence. Chapter 9 inches. Do you think I'm better than them? Dorian had left to see the king for an hour. Lucius waited in the study, flipping through the book of bloodlines, taking in as much information as possible. After a while, an almost invisible side door crept open. Lucius was startled but kept quiet. His hand moved to the hilt of a silver knife he started carrying after that night in the rose garden. A scrawny shadow moved out of the darkness. It was a girl, just turning into an adult, though much smaller for her age. She was so pale, as if she had never seen much sunlight, and her eyes looked too big for her tiny face. Lucius could tell she was not a vampire by then. There was something skittish and evasive that could only find in human slaves. Besides, her clothes, though clean, were threadbare and tatty, and her long brown hair was too unkempt. She let out a surprised and scared yelp as she noticed Lucius, but then she paused. You are a human. Lucius answered reservedly, I suppose. She scanned Lucius's appearance as a realization dawned on her, and she pell-mell dropped to the ground on her knees. I'm sorry, Your Holiness. I didn't know you were here. I heard no sound, and I thought everyone had left. It's all right. Who are you? Lucius tilted his head and inquired curiously. My name is Rose, the girl answered timidly. Are you a? Lucius hesitated to utter that word. But Rose understood it well. Yes, I am a house slave. My duty is to clean the rooms after all the masters left. Lucius stood up and walked toward her. She flinched as he got too close. A self-defense instinct against a potential punishment. Lucius extended a hand and said softly, no need to kneel to me. She stared at his hand briefly before taking it sheepishly, stealing a few glances at his face. Lucius chuckled amusingly. You know who I am. Yes, everyone knows. You mean every one of us here. Understanding the meaning behind the words, she quickly nodded. I don't see too many slaves around here, though. Most of them are with some visiting lords. Rose explained, there are about 200 of us living here. Most of us are not allowed to show our faces in front of lords and ladies. We are too dirty and lowbred to be seen. We do most of the cleaning and chores when no one is present. 200 humans were living in the citadel. How come no one told him anything about it in Anther? And who is your master? We are the house slaves. Everyone in the Ashdown family is our master. Including you, my lord. She paused for a second and added, though we report to maids and guards. Lucius's gaze passed her and lingered at the secret door she came from. He came closer and looked into the darkness. It was a poorly lit tunnel, so narrow that only one slender grown-up could pass through. Do you all travel between different rooms in these secret tunnels? Yes. It leads to our pens underground. We are not allowed to walk in the hallways in blatant sight. Lucius wasn't surprised as he had heard rumors about human slaves' living conditions in Eternia. However, he didn't anticipate that a complete secret structure would be built for the slaves only. So you can go to any room you want. No. There are surveillance cameras everywhere in the tunnel, and they planted tracking chips on us. If we are in the wrong place, this thing will shock us real bad. She pointed at the red collar on her neck. Lucius gazed into the tunnel longer, contemplating all the new information he got. But as he turned back to face the girl, a disarming sympathetic expression occupied his countenance. I'm sorry for bothering you with so many questions. I'm very new to this place. Oh, no, it's not bother. Many of us are overjoyed that Your Holiness is here. Especially my mom. She really wants to meet you. She smiled sheepishly. I was born here, and I've never seen any human like you, Your Holiness. Lucius knew well what she meant, but he asked amiably nonetheless, what am I like? You are exactly like I imagined. She stared at her own bare feet, blushing. Just then, someone's footsteps were approaching. Rose was startled and hastily retracted into the tunnel. I'm sorry, Your Holiness. I can't be seen. she exclaimed, panicking. It's okay. Go. We can talk next time. Lucius cringed at his own overly soft voice. But the girl seemed to buy it as she blushed even deeper. The secret door was shut just as the study's door opened. A servant came in and told Lucius that Dorian wouldn't finish anytime soon and would meet him at dinner. Lucius decided to go back to their living quarters and beguile the rest of the night there and do some research and read online about the elders. As he traversed the halls, a group of loud nobles was approaching. The one most noticeable among them was Sylvan. He wore a well-fitting riding outfit, an equestrian helmet under his left arm. The group noticed Lucius instantly, which elicited a dash of anxiety in him. Sylvan bowed slightly in front of him and smiled graciously. Good night. It's a delight to see you again. Lucius didn't smile back. He replied sarcastically, trying not to show his tenseness. It is indeed a God's miracle that I am still alive and breathing. Everyone around them went quiet as no one expected the skittish human prey who was too scared to leave the room for half a month to talk back. Remorse and regret tinged Sylvan's graceful features. He stepped forward and lowered his head. I'm sorry for what my brother did that night. You are sorry? Lucius tilted his head inquisitively. Is that all? Did your brother receive any punishment? Dorian had given him a memorable beat-up. So have I heard, Lucius said coldly. If my information is true, Dorian is also severely berated by the king for harming his precious youngest son. Sylvan signed. It's always hard for a father to see his son get hurt. But both mother and I have made sure Archie learned his lesson. How did you make sure? Lucius scoffed. Doesn't Eternia has laws against attempted rape and murder? Does he get a free pass because he is a prince? Or because I am a lowly human even though I am Dorian's consort? Or is it that Eternia doesn't have a law for such sort of things? The air went still. One of the nobles exclaimed, surely you are not suggesting sending Prince Archie to jail? I am not suggesting anything. I'm merely wondering. That's all. Knowing that he had struck some nerves, Lucius returned a head bow and left with his guards. He had no illusion that Archie would be seriously punished for what he did. But it would at least stir up some rumors and tensions. Within 2 days, the rumor that Crown Prince Consort wanted to press charges against Prince Archie spread to every corner of the citadel. Why did you say that to Sylvan? Dorian stormed into the room, seething with a cold fume. Lucius was working on something on his laptop. He looked up from the screen and raised one side of his brows. What did I say? That Archie is above the law. Isn't he, though? Dorian put a hand on his forehead as if having an enormous headache. I know he should be punished. And I also promised I will make him pay. But it has to be done in a more circuitous way. I know that. Quote, then why did you provoke them? Lucius closed the laptop and leaned into the armchair calmly. Why do you worry about provoking them so much? You are the crown prince, and they are just princes of a concubine. Dorian glowered at him. You can't be this naive. It must be hard watching the woman who usurped your mother's position and pretty much got her killed brandishing her fortune in front of you every day, acting as if she is the queen. They must have tried many ways to get rid of you already, but somehow you thrived and gained enough favor from your father to name you his heir. Is endurance your major strategy? Lucius said in a matter-of-fact tone, but it still angered Dorian more. The light in the room once again dimmed significantly, and it was so cold that the exhaling air turned into mist. So you checked my wiki page and decided you've known my 105 years of life story. Lucius stood up to face him. I'm not trying to anger you. I'm just saying you will always be their enemy, no matter what you do. No matter how much you lay low and take their shit. And your father will always favor those 2 sons more than you, no matter how much better you are than any of them. Better? Why do you think I'm better than them? Dorian approached Lucius formidably. His looming monstrous shadow stretched long behind him. Lucius tried his best not to flinch. You are the reason that the war that was destroying my country is stopped. And you have tried your best to protect me even though I am not the one you want. Do you know that saying someone is nice in vampire culture is an insult? Dorian now stood very close to him, looking down at him and baring his teeth menacingly as he grabbed Lucius's jaw roughly. I don't know what mission you received from your king, but stop playing with things you do not understand. If I find out that you are trying to harm Eternia in any way, I will show you what is true horror, and what Archie did was merely child play compared to it. Lucius was seized by fear, petrifying like a stone. All his courage dissipated instantly, and he couldn't even utter a word as if an invisible hand was strangling him, choking out all the air. For a moment, he thought he saw the shadow behind Dorian become giant black wings, and a demonic redness was burning in the vampire's irises. And he could only start to breathe after Dorian let him go. He gasped at the air and fell into the armchair. "Don't try to stir any trouble in this court ever again," Dorian snarled at him before he left. Lucius remained on the chair for a long while. The overwhelming rush of fear ebbed when Dorian exited the room, but something else lingered. Something bitter and damp that tasted like sadness. Many moments of the past month flashed across his mind. The erotic sensation when Dorian's mouth touched his neck as he bit him. The strength of his arms when he held him. The deep and resonating voice as he recounted the histories of the aristocratic families. The rich, musky smell as he leaned close to point at something in the book. He almost liked him. Chapter 10 Doomed Trip. Lou, wake up. It was a hot summer night. Lucius was shaken awake by Julian in the middle of the night. He probed his eyelids open and asked in delirium, "Huh? What?" Julian was kneeling next to his bed, his hazel eyes gleaming like shattered diamonds in the moonlight. "He talked to me again." Lucius sat up and rubbed his eyes. "Who talked to you?" "Who else?" Lucius sighed and asked quietly, "Are you sure it was not a dream?" "No, because I wasn't asleep. I was praying to him about the refugees, and then I heard his voice. It was just as last time, I can't describe, but it was the most beautiful sound I've ever heard." Lucius looked at him quizzically. "Oh, Kay. What does he tell you then?" "He told me to go to Greendale refugee camp to save a man. He said if I do this, one day, all of us will be saved." Lucius rolled his eyes, dismissing his twin brothers, sacred inspirations, as usual. Their parents were elated about it, but Lucius always thought maybe it was hallucinations, which meant Julian should see a doctor. "Julian, why on earth would you want to go to Greendale? It's one of the most chaotic places in this world right now. If it's God's will, I will obey him." Julian dithered over an idea for a second and then continued gingerly, "And I hope you can come with me." Lucius goggled at his brother. "Is this also God's will?" "No. But I want you to be with me. I always feel calmer and safer when you are around." Lucius fell back into his bed and sank himself deeper into the blankets. "Nope. It's too far. Come on. It's summer break. What else do you have to do?" Lucius leered at him annoyingly from under the cover. "Excuse me, do you think you are the only one with important things to do? I'm with you every day. All you have this summer is just some pool parties with your friends, and getting drunk. Well, that's much more fun than what you proposed. Stop acting like you don't care, Lou." Julian snapped. "Why don't you want to spend time with me anymore? You barely talk to me these days." Lucius was unmoved by the accusation and replied offishly, "Maybe it's because I don't believe all your, 'Oh, I'm so special, I'm chosen by God,' craps. Heck, I don't even believe in God." "Don't say that." Julian's voice was full of hurt. "It's true." Lucius turned in the other direction and covered his head. He didn't want to witness the pain he had caused. "Now leave me alone to my sinful and debauched dreams, please." Lucius. Julian. "What?" Lucius yelled as he opened his eyes and almost jumped as he saw Dorian's inquisitive face. And his mind returned to the presence. The rumbling humming of the plane engine and the dry air of high altitude regained their magnitude. Outside the small window, the vast landscape lay quietly under the silver moonlight. Wispy clouds floated below them, casting large, ghostly shadows on the slowly churning planet. "You were zooming out," the vampire remarked. "Yeah, I do that sometimes." Dorian didn't inquire further, probably not interested in his daydreams. He simply said, "We are going to land in an hour." "Okay." Lucius's gaze lingered on Dorian several moments longer, and the vampire gave him a bemused look. "What?" Dorian asked. "Nothing." Lucius averted his eyes. He couldn't shake off a thought that just came to him. That memory, in which Julian asked him to go to Greendale with him for some God-sent mission about saving a man. Is it possible that Julian met Dorian in Greendale? It was about 6 years ago, right after their 20th birthday, and Julian joined the seminary the very next year, and there couldn't be any other chance of him meeting a vampire without anyone knowing. Moreover, Dorian was still in exile at the time, and his mother had just passed away. Could it be possible that somehow he ended up in Greendale? He couldn't dwell on the speculation for too long as soon as the plane landed. And new anxiety overtook him. It was the first time he appeared in public as Dorian's consort. He had no idea how he would be received by a bunch of vampire nobles who probably all possessed some human slaves back home and media who would surely make fun of him. A black antique car and more than 10 other cars for the royal bodyguards and entourages were waiting on the tarmac to take them to Lord Dirchfall's manor. The impressive motorcade cruised through the murky forests like a disjointed train. Darkness and quietude were thicker and stranger in the rural wilderness, and trees and the lurking owls were whispering some ominous secrets. Dorian had been reading something on his phone the whole trip and didn't try to make many conversations, which irked Lucius immensely. Why did Dorian have to be so unreadable and stone-cold? He was anxious enough with the thought of appearing in public. The tension had been growing between them since their last fight, but Lucius wasn't preparing to apologize for what he said. For fuck's sake, he was the victim. Yes, it was a trap, and Lucius premeditatively used himself as a lure, but Archie fell for it too easily. Besides, if Dorian hadn't thrown Lucius on the side and put him in a perilous situation, he wouldn't have needed to risk his life just to get the crown prince's attention. Lucius was in the middle of a self-pitying brooding when something moved at the corner of his eyes. He looked outside the window but couldn't see much, as the forest was overgrown and shielded most of the moonlight. But just as he was about to dismiss it as an optical illusion, Dorian's expression changed instantly as he pulled Lucius into his arms and pressed him down. At the same moment, a blindly bright light blasted over his head, and a hot wave of air rushed over him like a deluge. Loud sounds exploded in his ear, and he could hear the screechy sound as the car disintegrated. But before he could be scared for his life, the strong arms holding him lifted him up, and soon the light and burning heat dissipated into the coolness and scent of the night. He realized that Dorian was carrying him, and his body was supported by nothing else other than the vampire's arms. He looked up and saw two pieces of giant shadow looming over him, almost covering the sky, and as they flapped, it dawned on him that those were two huge, black, bat-like wings. "Holy shit, you can fly!" Lucius couldn't help but exclaim in disbelief, though the wind greatly drowned his voice. The vampire rolled his eyes as his hyper-acoustic sense obviously caught Lucius's words. He swiftly dived into a cloud of thick tree branches and leaves like a hawk, eliciting a scream from Lucius, and landed quietly as a feather on one giant bough. "Keep your voice down," Dorian whispered, and his right arm held Lucius tight, keeping him from falling from the majestic elm. Not far from them, the car they were in moments ago was burning, and the guards and entourages all rushed out of their vehicles and yelled something. "What just happened?" Lucius asked under his shaky breath. "Someone attacked us," Dorian said. He shrouded his wings around both of them like a cloak, hiding them in the shadows. Lucius noticed one of the wings had big patches of burned marks and blisters. Dorian probably used it to shield most of the blast as he took both of them out of the exploding car. It must be a high-energy concentration weapon if it was capable of leaving burn marks on Dorian, which was very expensive and hard to procure. This was no regular assassination. Someone powerful and resourceful planned it. A scream lacerated the silence. Something huge and fast dashed out of the forest and took one of the guards. It happened so fast that Lucius couldn't tell if it was just a gasp of wind that carried the guard away. The guard's scream was cut short as a chilling noise of bone being crushed echoed somewhere deep in the forest. "Werewolves!" someone shouted. It was the first time Lucius saw a werewolf in real life. Most of them lived in the eastern region of Eternia and were believed to be much more relentless and ferocious than vampires. They had generations of feuds against vampires, yet human nations were reluctant to seek them out as allies only because they also saw humans as prey. More giant shadows dashed out of the veil of darkness, and the vampires were ready this time. Some of the vampires changed into their beast forms. Their body grew larger and taller, sinewy muscles twined and bulged, their ears pointy like bats, their teeth sharpened into lethal fangs, and their fingers transformed into knife-like claws. Others who didn't have the shape-shifting gifts took out their gun and fired silver bullets. A giant black wind clashed with a similar-sized vampire beast and revealed its true form. A gigantic wolf size bigger than a strong male bull, covered in black furs. And yet there were some humanoid traits. Their back legs were much stronger than regular wolves, making them able to walk, run and jump on two legs like humans. And their front claws took the shape of five-fingered hands. Both monsters had supernatural speed that Lucius couldn't even capture with mundane eyes. Both tried to maul and bite each other, and blood splashed everywhere. Some vampires were faster than werewolves and were able to gain some advantage over the enemies, but as more and more werewolves rushed out of the forest, they were greatly outnumbered. Whoever planned this did not want to leave anything alive behind. Another long howling echoed somewhere behind Dorian and Lucius, and then another as if replying to the first one. Lucius's heart jumped to his throat. There are more. We are surrounded. Lucius was not ready to be mutilated and eaten alive by frenzy werewolves. It was surely much less euphoric than a vampire's deathly bite. Dorian said quietly, "Hold the tree tightly and stay very still. I will try to delude them, but they may be able to see through it if you move too much. Can't we just fly away? My wing is wounded. We won't be able to make it far enough. There are too many of them. Our best chance is to hide," Dorian said calmly and showed no pain despite the horrible burns on his right wing. Lucius pell-mell clutched at the closest bough with all his strength. Dorian let go of Lucius's waist and crouched down on the bough, his giant wings spread behind him like a dark cloak. He closed his eyes and listened to the wind and the ineffable whispers between the trees. The echo of all the sounds made by any living creature weaved into a lively picture in his mind, and he could see the exact location of all the werewolves within 3 miles. 5 werewolves were approaching the motorcade, all trained killers, as they moved with unusual stealth for a regular werewolf. One of them was probably carrying the high-energy weapon that melted their car. Lucius saw Dorian's irises glow in an ominous red, and something intangible and shapeless extended from his body and radiated into every direction like the ripple on a tranquil lake. As the ripple traveled through space, strange things happened. The trees' positions subtly changed, and the ground also shifted. It still looked like the forest a moment ago, but completely different simultaneously. Illusory art, Lucius thought, a delicate and complex magic that some apostle vampires are proficient at. It is a powerful ability that manipulates and beguiles all sentient creatures' sensory input in a radial range, making them see, hear, smell and even feel a different and false reality. The stronger and older the vampire was, the more real the illusion was, and the harder for the victims to escape from it. According to tales and legends, a famous ancient vampire, who happened to be one of the ancestors of the Ashdown family, was able to trap a whole kingdom of people in his fantasy reality for decades. It was almost like creating a new world. But for most younger vampires who inherited the gift, the illusion always had some minor defects which, if detected by the target, would lead to disillusion. Soon, the werewolves tearing the flesh off some dead vampire bodies suddenly paused, then turned and lunged at each other. They attacked their associates ferociously and brutally as if they were enemies, tearing off limbs and smashing skulls between their powerful claws. Meanwhile, more commotion commenced in the nearby forests. The howling and screaming and trees falling from the fights echoed. Lucius saw one brown-furred werewolf stumbled into his sight, and the other dashed into him and gouged one of his eyeballs out with her claw. Lucius tried to repress nausea bubbling in his throat as he watched the 2 werewolves continuously slam into each other and take away chunks of flesh, and the mossy ground turned red as their blood splashed everywhere. Eventually, both of them slowed down as they lost too much blood. Just then, Dorian moved. He leapt off the bough and moved so fast that Lucius could only see his blurry afterimage. His 10 nails extended like 10 silver knives, and as he quickly dashed past the 2 werewolves, both of their head fell off their shoulders, and the mountainous bodies fell to the ground, gradually shrinking in size and all the fur shed off, revealing 2 headless human-like bodies. Lucius's mouth was open in astonishment. Dorian stopped on his track and wiped his cheek, and licked the smudge of blood away from his finger. He then looked up and said, "Stay here. I will go clean them up and come back for you." Lucius couldn't believe his ears. "What? Wait, don't leave me alone here." But the vampire was already gone.